The quiet suburban street of Pine Grove had always been a peaceful place, where perfectly trimmed lawns and friendly waves were part of daily life. Mrs. Henderson stood at her kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, watching the moving truck pull up next door. Her grip tightened around the mug as she observed the Martinez family stepping out of their car. The spring breeze carried the sounds of children's laughter as two young Martinez kids chased each other around the moving boxes. Their parents, dressed in casual moving day clothes, directed the movers with warm smiles despite their obvious exhaustion. But Mrs. Henderson saw none of the joy in this scene. Instead, her face twisted with disapproval as she picked up her phone to call her longtime friend from the neighborhood watch. "They're here," she whispered into the phone, as if sharing classified information. "Did you see what kind of car they're driving? Much too expensive for—" She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Something's not right about this. I just know it." Over the next few days, Mrs. Henderson kept meticulous notes of everything the Martinez family did. She documented when their lights went on and off, which friends visited them, and even what groceries they brought home. Her notebook filled with observations that seemed suspicious to her, but would appear completely normal to anyone else. The Martinez family, meanwhile, threw themselves into making their new house a home. Mr. Martinez spent weekends carefully planting a vegetable garden in the backyard, while Mrs. Martinez arranged stunning flower beds along their front walkway. Their children's laughter echoed through the neighborhood as they played basketball in their driveway, often joined by other kids from nearby houses. What really got under Mrs. Henderson's skin was how quickly the neighborhood seemed to warm up to them. She watched through her curtains as Mrs. Chen from across the street brought over a homemade welcome cake. The Williams family invited the Martinez kids to join their weekend soccer games. Even old Mr. Johnson, who rarely spoke to anyone, was seen chatting and laughing with Mr. Martinez about classic cars. One evening, as Mrs. Henderson was organizing her garden, which really meant eavesdropping on the Martinez family's backyard barbecue, she overheard their younger daughter practicing violin. The beautiful melody of Amazing Grace floated through the air, and for just a moment, Mrs. Henderson felt something stir in her heart. But she quickly pushed it aside, returning to her task of documenting what she considered suspicious activities. The final straw for Mrs. Henderson came when she learned the Martinez family had been invited to host the neighborhood's annual spring potluck, an honor she had held for the past 5 years. She paced her living room, muttering about traditions and the way things used to be, while plotting what she would do next. That night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by her notes and grievances, Mrs. Henderson began crafting complaint letters to the Homeowners Association. She convinced herself she was protecting her property values and neighborhood character, never once stopping to question why she felt so threatened by a family whose only crime was being different from her. Little did she know, her carefully constructed world of prejudice was about to be shaken to its core, and the truth about the Martinez family would force her to confront everything she thought she knew about her new neighbors. The next few weeks brought a steady stream of petty complaints from Mrs. Henderson. She started with small things, like calling the city inspector about the height of the Martinez family's grass, even though their lawn was always perfectly maintained. When that didn't work, she stepped up her game. One quiet Sunday morning, while most neighbors were getting ready for church, Mrs. Henderson marched up to the police officer who regularly patrolled their street. "Officer," she said, wringing her hands dramatically, "I'm concerned about all the cars that visit that house." She pointed to the Martinez home, where a few friends had gathered for a casual weekend brunch. "It just doesn't seem right. All these people coming and going at all hours." The officer, who had already received 3 similar complaints from her that month, tried to hide his frustration. "Ma'am, having friends over isn't a crime," he explained patiently. "And 11 a.m. on a Sunday isn't exactly suspicious hours." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't satisfied. She took her campaign to social media next, joining the neighborhood's online community group. Her posts started innocently enough, questions about unusual activity and declining property values. But other neighbors quickly saw through her thinly veiled prejudice. Mrs. Chen finally had enough and responded to one of her posts. "The only unusual activity I've seen is someone taking photos of their house every day." Now that's concerning. The Martinez family noticed everything but chose to respond with kindness. When Mrs. Henderson's newspaper landed in their yard by mistake, they'd walked it over to her door. When her garbage can blew over in a storm, they helped clean up the mess. Each act of kindness seemed to fuel her anger even more. Things got worse when the Martinez family's oldest child was chosen to represent their school in a regional science competition. The local paper ran a small story about it, and neighbors put up congratulatory signs. Mrs. Henderson tore down every sign she could reach, muttering about unfair advantages and lowered standards. The neighborhood watch meetings, once boring discussions about loose dogs and stolen packages, became tense affairs. Mrs. Henderson would arrive with folders full of evidence, mostly innocent photos of the Martinez family going about their daily lives. Other members started skipping meetings, tired of her obsession. One evening, while Mrs. Henderson was making her usual rounds of the neighborhood, she overheard two longtime residents talking. "Remember how worried we were when the old Johnson house went up for sale?" one said. "And now look, the Martinez family has done more for this neighborhood in 3 months than anyone else has in years." This conversation sent Mrs. Henderson into a tailspin. She spent that night pacing her house, looking out different windows at the Martinez home, which sat peaceful and warm in the gathering dusk. Through their kitchen window, she could see the family having dinner together, laughing and talking. The scene looked so normal, so familiar, that for a brief moment, doubt crept into her mind. But instead of letting this doubt lead to reflection, Mrs. Henderson doubled down. She started making notes about every car that parked on their street, taking down license plate numbers. She installed extra security cameras, all pointed at their house. She even started following Mrs. Martinez to the grocery store, convinced she would catch her doing something wrong. The other neighbors watched this escalation with growing concern. They saw how the Martinez children now hurried straight inside after school, instead of playing in their yard. They noticed Mr. Martinez checking their security cameras more frequently, and they saw Mrs. Martinez's once bright smile becoming strained whenever she encountered Mrs. Henderson. Nobody realized that Mrs. Henderson's obsession was building towards something much worse. As she sat in her darkened living room that night, surrounded by her evidence and fueled by baseless suspicions, she began planning something that would change everything, not just for the Martinez family, but for herself and the entire neighborhood. The Saturday morning started like any other in the neighborhood. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and families were starting their weekend routines. The Martinez family was preparing for something special, their daughter's music recital celebration. They had invited a small group of neighbors and her music teacher to celebrate her recent achievement. Mrs. Henderson watched from behind her curtains as colorful balloons were tied to the mailbox. The sight of people helping to carry dishes and small decorations into the Martinez home made her blood pressure rise. She had spent the whole week convincing herself that this gathering must be something suspicious. Early afternoon brought the sound of gentle classical music and children's laughter from the Martinez's backyard. The music teacher had brought her violin, and together with the young girl, they performed a beautiful duet. Neighbors sat in lawn chairs, applauding warmly after each piece. Even old Mr. Johnson, who usually complained about any noise, sat there with a content smile on his face. Something inside Mrs. Henderson snapped. The happiness and acceptance she witnessed felt like a personal attack on everything she believed in. She paced her house, growing more agitated with each passing minute. The sound of appreciation and joy from next door became unbearable to her ears. As the afternoon faded into early evening, most guests had left except for a few close neighbors helping with cleanup. Mrs. Henderson saw her chance. She grabbed a can of spray paint she bought just in case and waited until darkness fell. Her hand shook as she crept across her yard, but anger and prejudice had clouded her judgment completely. She started with the garden. that beautiful garden that had won Mrs. Martinez so much praise from the neighborhood. She pulled up the carefully tended flowers, scattering soil and petals across the lawn. The vegetable patch that Mr. Martinez had spent weekends perfecting was next, its tender plants crushed under her feet. But she wasn't done. With trembling hands, she pulled out the spray paint. The garage door became her canvas for hatred, its white surface soon covered with horrible words and symbols. She was so caught up in her destructive frenzy that she didn't notice the security cameras capturing everything, or the lights coming on in nearby houses. The Martinez's young daughter was the first to see the destruction the next morning. She had gone out early to practice her violin in the garden, as she often did on Sunday mornings. Her scream brought her parents running. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking, their lovingly created garden destroyed, hateful words defacing their home. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chan arrived first, phone already in hand calling the police. Mr. Johnson brought garbage bags and cleaning supplies. Within minutes, the entire street had mobilized to help, forming a human chain to clean up the mess. Mrs. Henderson watched from her window as the community came together. Instead of dividing the neighborhood, as she'd hoped, her actions had united them. She saw Mrs. Martinez hugging her crying daughter, while Mr. Martinez spoke quietly with the police officers who had arrived on the scene. The looks of determination on their neighbors' faces as they worked to erase her handiwork made her stomach churn. As police officers began going door to interview neighbors, Mrs. Henderson sat in her darkened living room, the gravity of what she'd done finally starting to sink in. She didn't know it yet, but her actions that night would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her neighbors, her community, and herself. The morning after the vandalism, the quiet neighborhood transformed into a hub of police activity. 2 patrol cars parked quietly on the street while officers gathered evidence. Detective Wilson, a veteran officer with kind eyes and graying hair, led the investigation with a mix of professionalism and compassion. "Don't worry about cleaning up just yet," he gently told Mr. Martinez, who stood protectively near his family. "We need to document everything first." The detectives' team worked methodically, photographing the damage and collecting samples of the spray paint. What caught their attention most was the garden. The senseless destruction of something so beautiful seemed particularly cruel. The neighborhood buzzed with activity as residents came forward one by one to share what they knew. Mrs. Chen approached the detective, her tablet in hand. "I have security camera footage," she said quietly. "I installed them after my own garden was vandalized last year. They point toward the street, but they might show something useful." Mr. Johnson, still in his morning robe, shuffled over with his own contribution. "Been having trouble sleeping lately," he explained to the detective. "Was up reading when I heard noises last night. Looked out my window and saw someone moving around the Martinez's yard. Didn't think much of it then, but now." His voice trailed off, heavy with regret. The pieces started coming together quickly. Several neighbors had doorbell cameras that captured different angles of the street. Others had witnessed strange behaviors in recent weeks. The detective listened carefully as they described the pattern of harassment that had been building. The complaints, the photographs, the constant watching. Inside her house, Mrs. Henderson tried to act normally, but panic was setting in. She hadn't expected so many cameras in the neighborhood. When the doorbell rang, her heart nearly stopped. Detective Wilson stood there, notebook in hand, asking routine questions as part of the neighborhood canvass. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" he asked, watching her reactions carefully. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she claimed she'd gone to bed early, but her nervous glances at the Martinez home and her inconsistent story only raised more red flags. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A teenage neighbor who had been walking his dog late that night had recorded a TikTok video. In the background of his dance routine, a figure could be seen moving through the Martinez's yard. The streetlights caught the distinct pattern of Mrs. Henderson's favorite nightgown. By afternoon, the evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from multiple angles showed the entire incident. Detective Wilson returned to Mrs. Henderson's house, this time with more direct questions. Faced with the evidence, she crumbled, tears streaming down her face as she admitted what she'd done. The Martinez family watched from their porch as Mrs. Henderson was led to a police car. Their reaction surprised many. There was no joy or satisfaction in their faces, only sadness. "We don't want revenge," Mr. Martinez told Detective Wilson. "We want understanding. We want change." The neighborhood gathered that evening for an impromptu meeting at the community center. The discussion wasn't about punishment. It was about healing and prevention. How do we make sure this never happens again? Mrs. Chen asked the group, "How do we build a stronger community from this?" As Detective Wilson wrapped up his initial investigation, he couldn't help but notice how the community had come together. Children from different families played together on the sidewalk while their parents discussed plans to replant the Martinez's garden. The ugliness of the previous night was being transformed into something beautiful. The investigation would continue through official channels, but the real work of healing had already begun in the neighborhood. Unknown to everyone, this incident would lead to discoveries about the Martinez family that would shake Mrs. Henderson's prejudices to their very core. The truth came out in the most unexpected way. While Mrs. Henderson sat in the police station being processed, her daughter rushed in with news that would change everything. Little Tommy, Mrs. Henderson's precious grandson, had been rushed to the children's hospital with severe appendicitis. "Mom," her daughter said, tears streaming down her face, "they're saying he needs emergency surgery. They've called in their best pediatric surgeon." The irony of fate was about to reveal itself in the most powerful way possible. Hours later, Mrs. Henderson paced the hospital waiting room, temporarily released to be with her family during this crisis. Her handcuffs had been removed, though an officer stood quietly nearby. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. A nurse walked in, clipboard in hand. "The surgeon's on her way to speak with you," she said kindly. "Dr. Martinez is the best pediatric surgeon we have. Your grandson is in excellent hands." Mrs. Henderson froze. "Martinez," she whispered, her face turning pale. Surely it couldn't be. But it was. The same Mrs. Martinez whose garden she had destroyed just hours ago walked through the door, still in her surgical scrubs. Her face showed no sign of recognition or anger, only professional compassion. "Tommy's surgery went perfectly," she explained, maintaining her composure. "We caught the appendicitis just in time. Another hour of delay could have been dangerous." Mrs. Henderson collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by the realization that the woman she had targeted had just saved her grandson's life. But the revelations weren't over yet. As Mrs. Martinez left the room, a group of military veterans in the hallway snapped to attention. Mr. Martinez was there, still in his service uniform after rushing from a ceremony where he'd received a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions during a rescue mission overseas. He had come to support his wife, despite everything that had happened. The veterans in the hallway shared stories about Mr. Martinez, how he'd saved an entire village during his last tour, how he still volunteered at the Veterans Center helping soldiers with PTSD, how he turned down profitable private security jobs to work as a high school counselor helping troubled teens. Each word felt like a dagger in Mrs. Henderson's heart. The family she had judged so harshly, had tried to drive away, had vandalized their home. They were heroes who had dedicated their lives to serving others. More truths emerged throughout the day. The gathering she had reported as suspicious. Weekly support groups for families of deployed soldiers. The expensive car she had questioned. A gift from grateful parents, whose children Mrs. Martinez had saved over the years. The strange packages being delivered. Medical supplies for free clinics where they volunteered. Mrs. Henderson's daughter washed her mother's face as each new piece of information sank in. "Mom," she said quietly, "Tommy's alive because of Mrs. Martinez. How many other children has she saved while you were busy trying to run her family out of the neighborhood?" The weight of her actions, the depth of her prejudice, and the magnitude of her error in judgment crashed down on Mrs. Henderson all at once. She looked out the hospital window at the setting sun, remembering how just yesterday she had been planning to protect her neighborhood from these people who spent their lives protecting and saving others. In the pediatric recovery room, little Tommy slept peacefully, unaware of how his emergency had unveiled a truth that would forever change his grandmother's life. Outside his room, two families stood separated by a hallway and a history of prejudice, but connected by an act of healing that transcended all barriers. The days following Tommy's surgery were the hardest of Mrs. Henderson's life. She sat alone in her living room, all curtains drawn, surrounded by the weight of her shame. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mrs. Martinez in her surgical scrubs, saving her grandson's life just hours after she had destroyed their garden. The police had released her with an ankle monitor while awaiting trial. Her daughter had taken Tommy home from the hospital, but wouldn't speak to her beyond necessary updates about his recovery. "He's doing well," she'd say shortly on the phone. "Thanks to Dr. Martinez." Each time she said the name, Mrs. Henderson felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. One morning, she forced herself to look out her window. The Martinez's garden, once so beautiful, lay in ruins because of her actions. But something was happening outside. Neighbors had gathered with shovels, plants, and wheelbarrows full of soil. Even from a distance, she could see Mrs. Chen directing people where to plant new flowers, while Mr. Johnson carefully rebuilt the vegetable garden boxes. She watched as the Martinez children helped plant new seedlings, their faces bright with hope despite what she had done to their home. The sight of their resilience broke something inside her. For the first time, she saw them not as intruders or threats, but as children just like Tommy, who deserved to grow up in a world without hate. That afternoon, she received a letter from her neighborhood association. She opened it with trembling hands, expecting a formal notice of eviction. Instead, she found a detailed account of the Martinez family's contributions to the community over their short time there. The list was long. Mrs. Martinez's free medical clinics, Mr. Martinez's work with troubled teens, their children's volunteer work at the local animal shelter. Each word felt like a blow to the walls of prejudice she had built around her heart. She thought about all the times she had called the police on their family gatherings that, she now knew, were support groups for military families. She remembered reporting their suspicious late-night activities, nights when Mrs. Martinez was performing emergency surgeries at the hospital. The shame became physical. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time a car drove past, she imagined it was another neighbor coming to witness her disgrace. The proud woman who had appointed herself neighborhood watchdog now couldn't even check her mail without feeling the weight of judging eyes. One evening, she heard a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she saw her grandson Tommy, standing there with a drawing in his hand. Her daughter waited at the bottom of the driveway, arms crossed. When she opened the door, Tommy held up his artwork, a crayon drawing of himself with Dr. Martinez, surrounded by hearts, and the words, "My hero." "Grandma," he said innocently, "why did you hurt my hero's garden?" The simple question from her grandson's lips struck deeper than any condemnation from the community. She had no answer that could justify her actions to this child, whose life had been saved by the very people she had tried to drive away. That night, Mrs. Henderson sat at her kitchen table with a blank notebook. She began writing, not excuses or justifications, but an honest examination of her prejudices. Where did they come from? Why had she held on to them so tightly? How had she allowed hate to blind her to the humanity of her neighbors? As midnight approached, she looked at the pages filled with her confession. Tomorrow would bring more shame, more consequences, more hard looks from neighbors. But for the first time since that terrible night, she felt something else beneath the shame. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be better. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Mrs. Henderson's hearing. She sat nervously at the defendant's table, watching as neighbors filed in to witness the proceedings. The Martinez family entered last, taking seats in the front row. Their presence made her stomach twist with anxiety and shame. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, reviewed the case files carefully. The evidence was clear: security footage, witness statements, and Mrs. Henderson's own confession left no room for doubt. The only question remaining was the sentence. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the state recommends the maximum penalty for hate-motivated vandalism." Mrs. Henderson's heart sank. She knew she deserved punishment, but the thought of jail time terrified her. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Martinez stood up and asked to address the court. "Your Honor," he said in a clear, steady voice, "our family has discussed this at length. We believe that sending Mrs. Henderson to jail won't solve the deeper problems that led to this incident." Mrs. Martinez joined her husband. "As a doctor, I've learned that healing is more important than punishment. We're asking the court to consider an alternative sentence, one that might help prevent this from happening to another family." Their proposal was unusual but thoughtful. Instead of jail time, they suggested a combination of community service at local immigrant support centers, mandatory anti-bias education, and regular meetings with a restorative justice counselor. The judge listened carefully, then turned to Mrs. Henderson. "The victims of your crime are showing remarkable compassion," she said firmly. "They're offering you an opportunity not just to serve your time, but to learn and grow from this experience. Do you understand the significance of this?" Mrs. Henderson stood on shaking legs. "I do, Your Honor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve their kindness, but I promise to work hard to become a better person." The sentence was handed down: 200 hours of community service at the local Immigrant Resource Center, weekly anti-bias education classes, and monthly restorative justice sessions. Additionally, she would need to pay for the damage to the Martinez's property and write a formal apology to be published in the local newspaper. Her first day at the Immigrant Resource Center was eye-opening. She met families who had fled war zones, doctors who were now working as janitors while trying to get their medical licenses transferred, and children who were translating for their parents while maintaining straight A's in school. Each story she heard chipped away at her prejudices. She learned about a Syrian refugee who had saved lives during bombing raids, much like Mr. Martinez had done in his military service. She met a Mexican grandmother who reminded her of herself, worried about her grandchildren's future in a new country. The anti-bias classes were equally challenging. She had to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and examine beliefs she'd held for decades. Sometimes she'd leave class with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization of how much harm such beliefs had caused. The hardest part was the restorative justice sessions, sitting face-to-face with the Martinez family, explaining her actions, and hearing directly how they had impacted not just them but their children. It was painful, but necessary. Their youngest child asked her once, "Why did you hate us before you knew us?" The question haunted her for weeks. Through it all, the Martinez family maintained their dignity and compassion. When Mrs. Henderson struggled to find the right words during sessions, Mrs. Martinez would often help her express her thoughts. Mr. Martinez shared stories about his own journey overcoming prejudice he'd faced throughout his life. As weeks turned into months, Mrs. Henderson found herself changing in ways she never expected. The anger that had driven her to such horrible actions was being replaced by understanding. The fear of differences was slowly transforming into curiosity about other cultures and experiences. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but with each passing day of her sentence, she worked harder to prove that the Martinez family's faith in rehabilitation wasn't misplaced. 6 months into her community service, Mrs. Henderson barely resembled the angry woman who had vandalized her neighbor's home. The Immigrant Resource Center had become more than just a place to serve her sentence. It had become a second home. She spent extra hours there, even after finishing her required time for the day. One rainy Tuesday, she sat with a newly arrived family, helping them practice English. Their young daughter reminded her of the Martinez children, and for the first time, she could smile at the memory without feeling overwhelming shame. The family shared homemade bread with her, its unfamiliar spices opening her mind to new experiences she would have rejected months ago. Her transformation became most apparent during the weekly cooking classes at the center. What started as part of her service hours turned into a beautiful exchange of cultures. She shared her mother's apple pie recipe, while others taught her to make dishes from their home countries. The kitchen filled with laughter and stories, breaking down barriers one meal at a time. The change in Mrs. Henderson caught the attention of local news reporters, but she turned down their requests for interviews. "This isn't about publicity," she told the center's director. "It's about becoming the person I should have been all along." Instead, she focused on doing the real work of changing hearts and minds, starting with her own. Her biggest test came when the center organized a cultural festival. Many volunteers were nervous about her involvement, given her history. But Mrs. Henderson worked tirelessly, helping to coordinate food stands, set up cultural displays, and ensured every participating family felt welcome and valued. During the festival, something remarkable happened. The Martinez children performed a violin duet, playing a piece that blended classical music with traditional Mexican melodies. Mrs. Henderson found herself in tears, not from shame this time, but from the beauty of the music and the realization of how much she had almost missed by closing her heart to others. The transformation wasn't always easy. Some days, old prejudices would try to creep back in, but now she had tools to combat them. She kept a journal of her experiences, writing down every lesson learned, every stereotype challenged, every moment of connection with people she once would have feared or rejected. Her grandson Tommy became a regular visitor to the center, eager to learn about different cultures and languages. Watching him play with children from around the world, Mrs. Henderson often thought about how close she had come to teaching him the same prejudices that had poisoned her heart for so long. One day, while helping to organize the center's library, she found a photo album from the previous year's celebrations. In it was a picture of the Martinez family at a community event, taken before they moved to her neighborhood. They were doing exactly what they did now, volunteering, helping others, being part of the community. The realization hit her. They hadn't changed at all. She had. The center's director noticed her growing commitment and asked her to help develop a program for other community members struggling with prejudice. At first, Mrs. Henderson hesitated, feeling unworthy of such responsibility. But then she realized, who better to help others change than someone who had made that journey herself? Working with the Martinez family and other community leaders, she helped create a series of workshops called Opening Hearts, Opening Minds. The program combined personal storytelling with practical exercises in empathy and understanding. To her surprise, several of her former neighborhood watch friends signed up. As her mandatory service hours neared their end, Mrs. Henderson faced a decision. She could walk away, having served her sentence, or she could continue the work that had become her passion. The answer came to her one morning as she watched the sunrise from her kitchen window, looking out at the now restored Martinez garden blooming with flowers from around the world. She realized that her true sentence wasn't measured in hours of service, but in lives touched and minds changed. Her transformation had become more than personal redemption. It had become a mission to help others avoid the path she had taken. 1 year to the day after the vandalism incident, the community center buzzed with anticipation. The large meeting room was packed with faces both familiar and new. Mrs. Henderson stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she looked out at the crowd. This was the moment she had both dreaded and looked forward to, her chance to publicly acknowledge her journey. A year ago, she began, her voice shaky but determined. I stood in this same room as a different person, a person filled with fear and hate, someone who thought she was protecting her neighborhood, when in reality, she was destroying everything that makes a community beautiful. The room fell silent as she shared her story. She didn't sugarcoat her actions or make excuses. Instead, she spoke honestly about her prejudices, her transformation, and the incredible people who had helped her change. In the front row, the Martinez family sat listening, their presence a testament to the power of forgiveness. She spoke about the Immigrant Resource Center, about the family she'd met there, and about how each story had chipped away at her wall of prejudice. She talked about Tommy's surgery and how Mrs. Martinez had saved him without a moment's hesitation, despite everything that had happened. "But this isn't just my story," she continued, gesturing to the back of the room where several of her former neighborhood watch friends stood. "This is about how one act of hatred turned into a movement of understanding." She unveiled her proposal, a new community unity program called Bridges. The initiative would partner longtime residents with newly arrived families, creating connections through shared meals, cultural exchanges, and mutual support. The Martinez family had helped her design it, drawing from their own experiences on both sides of prejudice. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Martinez joined her at the podium. "A year ago," he said, "we were victims of hate. Today, we stand here as partners in hope." He explained how their family had chosen to see beyond the vandalism to the bigger picture, the need for understanding and connection in their community. Mrs. Martinez shared next, speaking about her experiences both as a doctor and as someone who had faced discrimination. She talked about healing, not just physical healing in her work, but the emotional healing she'd witnessed in Mrs. Henderson over the past year. The presentation ended with a surprise. The neighborhood children, led by Tommy and the Martinez kids, performed a musical piece they had practiced in secret. The song, a blend of different cultural melodies, represented everything the new program stood for: harmony created from diversity. As the applause died down, Mrs. Henderson made one final announcement. She was donating her house to be used as a community gathering space when she moved to work full-time at the Immigrant Resource Center. "My home," she said, "once a place of isolation and fear, will become a place of welcome and connection." The day ended with a community dinner in the Martinez's backyard, the same yard she had destroyed a year ago. Now it bloomed with flowers from around the world, each plant representing a different family story. Children played together on a lawn while adults shared dishes from their various cultural backgrounds. Mrs. Henderson sat at a table, watching it all with tears in her eyes. Her grandson Tommy ran past, playing tag with the Martinez children and others from the neighborhood. They didn't see differences, they just saw friends. Later that evening, as the sun set on their gathering, Mrs. Henderson stood in the garden with Mrs. Martinez. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked softly. Mrs. Martinez smiled, gesturing at the diverse group of people laughing and talking together. "Look around," she said. "You already have your answer." The neighborhood had changed, not just in its appearance, but in its heart. What started as an act of hate had transformed into a movement of love, understanding, and connection. As the stars began to appear in the evening sky, their light seemed to shine down on a community that had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the best way to overcome darkness is to add more light.